Before the light comes, there is only cold. In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, the hours before sunrise carry a particular kind of silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of waiting. The air is thin up here, sitting above 5,000 feet of elevation, and in the deep months of the year, it bites against exposed skin with a steady, patient pressure. The stars above are extraordinary. In the absence of any significant source of artificial light for miles in any direction, the sky over this canyon is among the darkest in the American Southwest. And on clear nights, the stars do not merely twinkle at the edges of perception. They crowd the darkness from horizon to horizon, thick and layered and impossibly numerous. You cannot see the canyon in the dark. You can only sense it. Before we go any further, a gentle note. If you are watching History Sleepy Time for the first time, welcome. If this kind of journey sounds right to you, consider subscribing. It costs nothing, and it means the next documentary will find you when it arrives. That is all. The canyon is waiting. The sandstone walls rise on either side without announcing themselves, pale forms against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. The canyon floor is flat and wide, broader than most visitors expect, and the wind moves through it in long, slow curves, carrying the smell of sage and dry earth and something older, something that has no easy name, the particular scent of rock that has been warmed by centuries of sun and cooled by centuries of night. The great stone formations that line the canyon rim are invisible now, their profiles dissolved into the darkness, and the enormous ruins that sit along the canyon floor are only shapes, barely distinguishable from the surrounding desert. But at the southern end of the canyon, one shape is different from all the others. Rising alone from the canyon floor, separate from the long sandstone cliffs that frame the canyon itself, there is a butte, an isolated mesa, steep-sided and flat-topped, climbing 340 feet above the desert floor. It is called Fajada Butte, and even in the dark, it has a presence that is difficult to explain. Something about its solitary position, about the way it stands apart from the surrounding walls, makes it feel like a marker, like something placed deliberately at the gateway of the canyon. And near the top of Fajada Butte, in a place that requires effort and attention to reach, something waits on a flat section of rock face. 3 large stone slabs lean against the cliff surface there, their positions the result of a long, slow geological process that separated them from the cliff and left them resting in their current arrangement. Behind those slabs, on the rock face itself, ancient hands carved spirals into the stone, careful, deliberate patterns whose exact meaning has not been established by archaeology and may never be fully known. But there is something that can be known. On certain days of the year, and most dramatically on the summer solstice, the longest day, when the sun reaches a particular position in the sky, something extraordinary happens. A narrow dagger of sunlight slips between the stone slabs. It passes through the gap in a thin, focused band of light and falls onto the spiral carved in the rock behind it. And as the minutes pass, that dagger of light moves slowly, steadily, bisecting the spiral from top to center with a precision that has caused researchers over the past several decades to study this place with considerable care. Why does the light fall exactly here? Why does it move exactly this way? Who noticed this long before anyone living today was born? And what did it mean to the people who built their world in this canyon, who raised enormous buildings from the canyon floor? Who organized the landscape across hundreds of miles of desert? What did it mean when the sun returned to this exact position on this exact day? Those are the questions that will carry us through this documentary. And the answers, the ones that exist and the ones that remain uncertain, are more interesting, more careful, and more deeply human than anything that a simple mystery could provide. To understand the sun dagger and to understand the people who may have observed it, you first have to understand where you are. Chaco Culture National Historical Park sits in the San Juan Basin of northwestern New Mexico, in a region that the Spanish colonial settlers of the 17th and 18th centuries would have recognized as some of the most demanding landscape in the Southwest. The basin is broad and open, ringed by distant mesas and broken by shallow washes and arroyos that carry water only after rain. The elevation of the canyon floor is roughly 5,400 feet above sea level, which means the air is thinner than in the lowlands. The temperature swings between seasons are dramatic, and the growing season for crops is shorter than it would be farther south. The canyon itself, Chaco Canyon proper, runs roughly east-west for about 9 miles, though the broader Chacoan landscape stretches far beyond those boundaries in every direction. The canyon was carved by Chaco Wash, a seasonal watercourse that drains the basin and carries runoff from the surrounding mesas during the months when rain falls. Today, Chaco Wash is dry for most of the year, a shallow channel of pale sandy soil cutting through the canyon floor, lined with cottonwoods and saltbush in the places where residual moisture lingers longest. The walls of the canyon rise on the north side to dramatic heights, with the great sandstone cliffs of the Chusca uplift visible in the distance. The south wall is lower, more broken, cut by side canyons and draws that open into the surrounding desert. And from the canyon floor, looking south toward the lower wall, the solitary profile of Fajada Butte is visible at the eastern entrance to the canyon, always present, always marking that boundary between the canyon interior and the open country beyond. The climate of Chaco Canyon is what geographers call a semi-arid or high desert climate. Average annual precipitation today hovers around 8 to 9 inches, most of it arriving in 2 distinct seasons. Summer thunderstorms, driven by the moisture-laden air of the North American monsoon, deliver brief and intense rainfall from July through September. A quieter winter precipitation pattern brings some snow and occasional rain from November through March. Between these 2 wet seasons, the spring months and early summer are characteristically dry, warm, often windy, with dust moving across the canyon floor in long, slow curtains. The vegetation reflects this aridity. Sagebrush dominates the open areas of the canyon floor, punctuated by rabbit brush and scattered clumps of grasses. Pinon pine and juniper occupy the higher ground and the canyon rims, their gnarled trunks twisted by decades of wind. In the side canyons and washes, where moisture accumulates slightly more reliably, the vegetation becomes denser, more willows, more cottonwoods, more of the plant communities that tell you water is occasionally available. It is not, on first impression, an environment that invites a great civilization. And yet something happened here that has no simple explanation. Beginning roughly in the 9th century of the Common Era and continuing with increasing intensity through the 11th and into the early 12th century. The ancestral Puebloan communities associated with this canyon built structures of a scale and architectural sophistication that remain more than 1,000 years later among the most impressive examples of pre-contact architecture in North America. They quarried sandstone from the canyon walls. They shaped that stone with tools of other stone. They raised walls several stories high. They organized enormous interior spaces, built complex systems of circular underground chambers, aligned their buildings to features of the sun and moon and distant landscape, and connected their canyon to communities across hundreds of miles of the surrounding Southwest through a network of carefully engineered roads. Why here? Why in this demanding, semi-arid canyon with its unreliable rainfall and its short growing seasons and its long, cold winters? That question does not have a single clean answer. But beginning to understand, it requires walking through the canyon itself and paying attention to what the land itself can tell us. Chapter 4, Fajada, Butte, and the First Impression of Stone. When visitors enter Chaco Canyon from the east, along the unpaved road that winds through the desert from the main highway, one of the first things they see, rising from the low flatlands at the canyon's mouth, is Fajada Butte. The butte is composed of the same Cretaceous age sandstone that forms the canyon walls throughout the Chaco region, a rock type known as the Cliff House sandstone, deposited in the shallow coastal environments of an ancient inland sea some 70 to 80 million years ago. Over the millions of years since that sea retreated, erosion, the patient work of wind and water, and the slow expansion of ice in cracks carved this sandstone landscape into the dramatic forms visible today. Mesas were isolated, cliff faces were undercut. Boulders carved from the walls and came to rest at various angles against the cliff bases or the open ground below. Fajada Butte is one result of this long erosional history. It stands apart from the main canyon walls because the rocks surrounding it eroded away more completely, leaving the butte isolated, a witness column of resistant sandstone that outlasted the softer material around it. Its sides are steep enough to discourage casual climbing. Its summit is largely inaccessible without careful navigation of specific ledges and routes. And near the top, where 3 large sandstone slabs lean against the cliff face in a particular arrangement, the geology has created something that may or may not have been recognized and used by the people who lived and worked in the canyon below. The slabs themselves are significant. They are large, the tallest reaches roughly 3 meters in height, and they lean inward against the cliff face at angles that create narrow gaps between them. Sunlight passing through those gaps does not fall as broad illumination, but as narrow, focused bands of light, dramatically constrained by the geometry of the slabs and the cliff behind them. These bands move across the cliff face as the sun moves across the sky, and their position changes with the season as the sun's angle changes through the year. Behind the slabs, on the cliff face itself, there are spiral petroglyphs, images pecked into the sandstone surface by removing the darker outer weathering layer to reveal the lighter rock beneath. The larger of the two spirals consists of roughly 9.5 turns. The smaller spiral is positioned some distance to one side. There is also a partial spiral, sometimes described as a third element in the grouping. These spirals were made by human hands. The technique, pecking the surface of the rock with a harder stone tool, is well documented at Chaco and across the broader Southwest. When the spirals were made is a question that archaeology has not fully resolved, though the petroglyphs are generally understood to be associated with the Chacoan period of occupation. The exact meaning of spiral petroglyphs in ancestral Puebloan rock art is a matter of ongoing research and interpretation. Spirals appear widely across the prehistoric Southwest and carry various associations in different cultural contexts. What makes the Fajada Butte spirals remarkable, what drew serious archaeological and archaeoastronomical attention to them, is not the spirals themselves, but what happens on certain days of the year when sunlight and shadow interact with them through the gaps between the stone slabs. And to understand that, we need to first understand something about the sun. The sun does not rise in exactly the same place every morning. This is something that people who pay attention to the landscape around them, people who watch the horizon regularly, season after season, eventually notice. In the summer months, the sun rises far to the northeast, climbs high and steep into the sky, arcs across a long path, and sets far to the northwest in the long summer evenings. In the winter months, the sun rises well to the southeast, climbs only modestly into the southern sky, follows a shorter and lower arc, and sets to the southwest while daylight still has hours remaining. This seasonal movement is the result of Earth's axial tilt, the 23.5-degree lane of our planet relative to the plane of its orbit around the Sun. As Earth moves through its year-long orbit, the tilt means that first one hemisphere and then the other is angled more directly toward the Sun, producing the familiar progression of seasons. The northern hemisphere receives its most direct sunlight around the summer solstice, which falls near June 20th or 21st each year, and its least direct sunlight around the winter solstice, near December 21st or 22nd. At the solstices, something specific happens. The sun's northward or southward movement along the horizon appears to pause. The word solstice itself comes from Latin words meaning sun stands still. For several days around the solstice, sunrise and sunset occur at nearly the same position along the horizon. Then, gradually, the direction reverses. Between the solstices, the sun's path crosses 2 points of particular symmetry, the equinoxes, which occur around March 20th and September 22nd or 23rd. At the equinoxes, day and night are approximately equal in length across the globe, and the sun rises almost exactly due east and sets almost exactly due west. For agricultural communities living in a high desert environment with a short growing season, tracking these solar cycles was not merely a philosophical or ceremonial interest. It had immediate practical consequences. knowing when to expect the last frost of spring, knowing roughly when to plant crops, knowing when to begin the preparations for winter storage. These were questions that the position of the sun along the horizon, combined with accumulated generational knowledge of local conditions, could help to answer. Human communities around the world, across many different cultures and historical periods, developed ways of observing and marking the movement of the sun through the year. Some built stone monuments. Some marked horizon features, a notch in a distant ridge, a peak that caught the first light of the solstice sunrise. Some used the interior spaces of their buildings, arranging doorways or windows so that light entered in specific ways at specific times of year. Some maintained detailed oral traditions that encoded seasonal knowledge in story and ceremony. What archaeologists and researchers who study Chaco Canyon have observed is that the people who built and used these extraordinary structures appear to have paid careful attention to the sun, and possibly to the moon and certain stars as well. The evidence for this attention appears in architectural alignments, in landscape relationships, and in the remarkable phenomenon at the top of Fajada Butte. How deliberate was this attention? How systematic was it? What precisely did these communities understand, and how did they encode and transmit that understanding? Those are questions that the evidence allows us to approach carefully and with appropriate humility about the limits of what archaeology can establish. Let us now walk carefully through what actually happens at Fajada Butte. The three large sandstone slabs near the top of the Butte lean against the cliff face. Their arrangement creates two main gaps through which sunlight can pass. When the sun is in certain positions, which occur only at specific times of day and specific times of year, sunlight enters through these gaps and falls onto the cliff face behind the slabs. In the middle of the morning, on the summer solstice, researchers have documented the following. Sunlight passing through the larger of the two gaps between the slabs falls onto the cliff face as a narrow, elongated shaft of light, the form that has given this phenomenon its name. That shaft of light, that dagger, falls directly above the center of the larger spiral petroglyph. As the minutes pass and the sun continues its arc across the sky, the shaft of light descends slowly through the spiral, bisecting it precisely through its center. Then, as the sun moves further, the light dagger passes downward and leaves the spiral. On the winter solstice, the geometry of sunlight and shadow through the slabs is different. Two shafts of light appear on either side of the larger spiral, flanking it symmetrically, while the center of the spiral lies in shadow between them. At the equinoxes, a relationship that has been observed and documented, but is considered somewhat less precisely defined than the solstice phenomena. A single shaft of light passes through the smaller spiral, and the larger spiral receives a dagger that bisects it at an angle rather than directly through the center. These are the observations. They have been carefully documented by researchers since the late 1970s. The phenomenon is real. The geometry of the slabs, the spirals, and the light is not imagined or invented. Something genuinely remarkable happens at this location at astronomically significant times of year. But the questions that follow from these observations require more care. The first and most fundamental question is, were the slabs placed in their current positions intentionally, specifically to create this light and shadow phenomenon? Or are the slabs the result of natural geological processes, boulders that carved from the cliff and settled in their current positions by chance? And the relationship between the slabs and the spirals a coincidence or something noticed and used after the fact? Researchers who have studied Fajada Butte closely have generally concluded that the positioning of the slabs and the location of the spiral petroglyphs are unlikely to be entirely coincidental. The precision of the summer solstice dagger, the way it descends through the exact center of the spiral on that specific day, is striking enough that most researchers consider it unlikely to be accidental. Anna Sofia, an artist and researcher working with the Solstice Project, is credited with documenting the phenomenon in 1977 and subsequently conducting detailed studies of it over many years. Her work, and the work of researchers who followed, brought the Fajada Butte spirals into serious archaeological and archaeoastronomical discussion. However, the interpretation of the phenomenon requires care. Observing that light behaves in a particular way at a particular time does not automatically tell us who created the spirals, when, why they were placed in this location, or what the phenomenon meant to the people who may have observed or used it. Archaeology can document the physical phenomenon. It can note the presence of the petroglyphs and their relationship to the light. It can consider the broader context of Chacoan society and the evidence for solar attention in Chacoan architecture more generally. But it cannot reach directly into the minds of people who lived 1,000 years ago and tell us with certainty what any of this meant to them. What the evidence can tell us is that the Fajada Butte site is one element within a larger pattern, a pattern of solar awareness that appears to have been embedded in various forms throughout the design and organization of Chaco Canyon. And that larger pattern is where the story becomes even more interesting. To understand why the Fajada Butte phenomenon matters within the broader context of Chacoan history, we need to spend some time with the structures that have made Chaco Canyon famous. The ancestral Pueblo people, or, using an earlier term still sometimes encountered in older literature, the Anasazi, built what archaeologists call great houses along the floor and walls of Chaco Canyon and throughout the surrounding region. The word Anasazi is Navajo in origin and has been variously translated, with enemy ancestors being one interpretation that has made many Pueblo descendants uncomfortable. For this reason, the term ancestral Pueblo has become widely preferred in contemporary archaeological and educational contexts, and that is the terminology this documentary will use. The great houses of Chaco Canyon are among the most architecturally significant structures built in pre-contact North America, north of Mexico. They are not simple villages. They are large, planned, multi-story buildings constructed of carefully shaped sandstone masonry, with hundreds of rooms, specialized interior spaces, and architectural details that speak to deliberate planning rather than incremental growth. The largest of them, Pueblo Bonito, occupies roughly an acre and a half of canyon floor on the north side of the canyon, against the great sandstone cliff. At its maximum extent, Pueblo Bonito contained somewhere between 600 and 800 rooms and reached 4 or 5 stories in height on the north side, where the cliff wall provided a natural backdrop. It was D-shaped in plan, its flat side facing the cliff and its curved facade facing the open canyon floor to the south. Within the D and outside it along the south face were great circular depressions, the Great Kivas, large enough to accommodate significant numbers of people in what are generally interpreted as ceremonial or communal spaces. Pueblo Bonito was not built all at once. Tree-ring dating, dendrochronology, has allowed researchers to establish construction sequences with considerable precision. The wood used in the roofs and floors of ancestral Puebloan structures was cut from living trees, and the rings in that would record each year of growth. By comparing the ring patterns from many different timbers, researchers have built a master chronology that allows them to date individual construction episodes. At Pueblo Bonito, major construction episodes have been identified spanning from roughly the mid-9th century to the early 12th century of the Common Era. The building grew in stages, with different sections added during different periods, reflecting what was clearly a long-term and intentional architectural project. Other great houses line the canyon. Chacoan, roughly a mile east of Pueblo Bonito, is nearly as large and features an unusual elevated rear wall and an interior colonnade, architectural elements with parallels in Mesoamerican building traditions, a connection that has been noted but not fully explained. Pueblo del Arroyo, Quincletso, Casa Rinconada, each great house has its own plan, its own construction history, its own particular relationship to the canyon floor and the walls and the sky. What strikes researchers who study these buildings closely is the evidence of architectural intentionality. These are not structures that grew organically, room by room, without planning. The great houses appear to reflect deliberate organizational decisions about orientation, scale, the placement of interior spaces, the relationship between interior and exterior, and researchers have increasingly come to argue the relationship between architecture and the movement of the sun. The relationship between Chacoan architecture and solar observation is one of the most studied and most carefully debated topics in southwestern archaeology. Let us begin with what can be directly observed. Pueblo Bonito is oriented with its long straight back wall running very close to an east-west line. This means that the wall faces almost directly south, receiving maximum sunlight during the winter months when the sun follows its lowest and most southerly arc across the sky. Whether this orientation was deliberately chosen to maximize solar warmth, to mark an astronomical direction, or to achieve some other purpose, practical, ceremonial, or both, is a question that archaeology cannot fully answer. What is clear is that the orientation is not accidental. Building a structure of this size with a nearly perfect east-west wall requires deliberate alignment. Researchers have also examined doorways and window-like openings in various Chacoan great houses for evidence of solar alignments. At Pueblo Bonito, a corner doorway in the northeastern section of the building is positioned so that the rising sun on the winter solstice shines directly through it along a specific interior path. This phenomenon, if deliberately designed, would have required the builders to observe the winter solstice sunrise carefully and to engineer the doorway's position to capture that specific light. The precision involved has led researchers to suggest that some Chacoan builders possessed detailed and systematic knowledge of solar movements. At Casa Rinconada, a great kiva on the south side of the canyon floor, certain wall niches appear to align with sunrise positions at important solar events. The kiva is roughly circular, sunk partially into the ground, with a diameter of approximately 19 meters, making it one of the largest great kivas known from the Chaco region. Its scale, its careful construction, and its possible solar alignments have made it a focus of archaeoastronomical attention. But here it is important to pause and apply the kind of careful thinking that responsible archaeoastronomy requires. How many possible alignments are there in any given large building? A structure with dozens of walls, hundreds of openings, and multiple cardinal directions will, by chance alone, produce some relationships with astronomical events. The challenge for researchers is not simply to identify alignments, but to evaluate them, to ask whether the alignment is precise, whether it is consistent with other evidence, whether it appears repeatedly across multiple structures, and whether it makes sense within the broader cultural and archaeological context. The researchers who have argued most strongly for intentional solar alignment at Chaco, including members of the Solstice Project and scholars like Ray Williamson, who studied Chacoan archaeoastronomy in the 1980s and 90s, have pointed to the cumulative pattern of alignments across multiple structures as evidence that solar observation was a genuine and systematic concern of Chacoan builders. When the same general orientation appears again and again across multiple great houses built over multiple generations, the argument for deliberate intent becomes stronger. Other researchers have urged caution. Some alignments that appeared compelling in early analyses have not held up under more rigorous testing. Some alleged astronomical relationships turn out to be approximate rather than precise, or to apply only at certain historical periods, given the small drift of astronomical positions over centuries. The scholarly literature on Chacoan archaeoastronomy reflects an ongoing, sometimes contentious conversation about how much can be confidently claimed and how much remains in the realm of reasonable but not yet proven interpretation. What this debate tells us is not that the evidence is meaningless. It is not. It tells us that archaeology, like all careful inquiry, requires calibrated confidence. The evidence from Chaco Canyon strongly suggests that solar awareness was embedded in Chacoan architectural thinking. The precise nature, extent, and meaning of that awareness is still being worked out. And the sun dagger at Fajada Butte sits at the center of that conversation, dramatic, precise, and still inviting the questions that have surrounded it since its documentation in the 1970s. There is a story told about the moment the sun dagger first came to the attention of modern researchers, and it is worth telling carefully because the way a discovery is framed matters enormously for how we understand what was actually found. In the spring of 1977, Anna Sofia, an artist who had come to Chaco Canyon to document petroglyphs, climbed to the upper reaches of Fajada Butte. She was recording rock art as part of a broader survey effort, working in the mid-morning hours when the light was good for photography and observation. What she encountered near the top of the butte, at a location where 3 large sandstone slabs leaned against the cliff face, was not something she had been specifically looking for. It was close to the summer solstice. As she worked near the slabs, she observed a narrow shaft of sunlight moving across the cliff face and passing through the center of a large spiral petroglyph. The precision of the movement and the timing relative to the solstice struck her as significant. She returned to document the phenomenon more carefully, and over the following years, she worked with researchers including Rolf Sinclair, a physicist, to study the site systematically across multiple solar events, solstices and equinoxes, and to document what the light and shadow did at each of those times. The results of that documentation were published in the journal Science in 1979, and the Fajada Butte spiral site, which Sofia named the Sun Dagger, entered the broader archaeological and scientific conversation. It is important to be clear about what this discovery was and what it was not. Sofia and her colleagues documented a physical phenomenon. They described, with careful observation and measurement, what happens to light and shadow at this site on astronomically significant days. That documentation was a genuine contribution to archaeological knowledge. The subsequent work of the Solstice Project, which Sofia founded, has produced detailed records of the phenomenon and has advocated for interpretations that go considerably further, arguing that the Sun Dagger was a deliberately engineered solar calendar, that the Chacoan great houses were laid out according to a sophisticated cosmological plan, and that the entire Chacoan landscape was organized around astronomical principles. Some of these broader interpretations have been received with enthusiasm in popular accounts of Chaco Canyon. They have also been received with varying degrees of skepticism by professional archaeologists, some of whom have questioned whether the evidence supports the more ambitious claims about deliberate design and cosmological intention. This is not a controversy that can be fully resolved in a documentary. It is an ongoing scholarly conversation, and it reflects genuine uncertainty about what the evidence actually demonstrates. What can be said with confidence is that the Fajada Butte phenomenon is real, that the precision of the summer solstice light dagger is striking, and that the phenomenon invites serious questions about Chacoan awareness of solar cycles. One important complication entered the picture in the 1980s. Researchers monitoring the site discovered that the position of the stone slabs had shifted slightly, probably as a result of foot traffic from visitors who had been climbing to the site since its documentation became publicly known. Even a small movement of one or more slabs changes the geometry of the light and shadow, potentially altering the precision of the alignments. As a result of this concern, the National Park Service closed the site to public access, and observation of the phenomenon at the site itself has since been limited to authorized research visits. This is a sobering footnote to the story. A site that had persisted through more than 1,000 years of desert weathering, seismic activity, and the slow geological movement of stone was altered within a few years of becoming known to the modern world. It also raises a question worth sitting with. The stone slabs at Fajada Butte are not perfectly fixed. They have moved, even slightly, in recorded time. How much might they have moved over 1,000 years? And if the current positions of the slabs are even slightly different from their positions in the 11th century, how does that affect our ability to assess the precision of the ancient phenomenon? These are not reasons to dismiss the sun dagger. They are reasons to hold our interpretation of it with the care and humility that the evidence deserves. The sun dagger brought Chaco Canyon into a field of inquiry that had been developing through the 20th century, a field known as Archaeoastronomy, or sometimes as cultural astronomy or skyscape archaeology, depending on the particular methodology and emphasis of the researchers involved. Archaeoastronomy, in its most straightforward definition, is the study of how people in the past understood and related to the sky. It draws on archaeology, astronomy, anthropology, history, and the documented traditions of living communities to investigate questions about ancient sky knowledge, how astronomical observations were made, how they were recorded, how they were organized into systems, and what role they played in the broader life of the communities that maintained them. The field has a complicated history, and that history is worth knowing because it helps explain why researchers sometimes disagree so strongly about specific sites and specific claims. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was considerable enthusiasm, sometimes uncritical enthusiasm, for finding astronomical alignments in ancient structures. Stonehenge in England was interpreted as a solar observatory. Various sites in the Americas were described as sophisticated astronomical instruments. Some of these interpretations were based on real observations, others were exaggerated or simply incorrect. The enthusiasm for ancient astronomy sometimes outpaced the evidence, and the field developed a reputation in some archaeological circles for overreaching. By the latter decades of the 20th century, more rigorous methodological standards began to develop. Researchers began to ask, what level of precision is required before an alignment can be considered intentional rather than coincidental? How many alignments in a structure with many possible orientations would be expected by chance? What is the range of uncertainty in identifying the exact observation point, the exact horizon feature, and the exact astronomical target? And what independent evidence, from the archaeological record, from historical documents, from documented cultural traditions, supports the interpretation of deliberate astronomical intent? These are the right questions. And applying them to Chaco Canyon produces a nuanced picture that is less dramatic than the most enthusiastic accounts, but more honest about what the evidence actually shows. The case for intentional solar awareness at Chaco is, in the view of many researchers, reasonably strong. The evidence is not limited to Fajada Butte. It includes architectural orientations across multiple great houses, the positioning of doorways and windows that appear to capture solstice, light, the possible alignment of the Chacoan road system with cardinal directions, and the broader context of Pueblo cultural traditions, in which the sun has historically played an important role in ceremonial and agricultural life. The case for a sophisticated, deliberately engineered cosmological system, one in which every major architectural element of the Chacoan landscape was precisely calculated and aligned according to a unified astronomical plan, is more ambitious and more contested. Making that case requires not just identifying individual alignments, but demonstrating that they form a coherent and intentional whole, that the degree of precision exceeds what chance or simple practical consideration would produce, and that the cultural context supports such a conclusion. That is a more difficult case to make, and archaeologists have not reached consensus on it. What makes Chaco Canyon particularly interesting within this conversation is the cumulative weight of the observations. No single alignment, taken alone, would be convincing evidence of systematic astronomical thinking. But when many alignments are observed across many structures built over many generations in the same canyon, by communities that shared a cultural tradition of solar awareness, the cumulative picture becomes more compelling, even if each individual element remains subject to debate. The honest answer from a methodological standpoint is that Chaco Canyon presents one of the strongest bodies of potential astronomical evidence in North American archaeology, and that the field is still working through exactly how much of that evidence reflects deliberate design, how much reflects practical orientation choices, and how much reflects the natural tendency of human constructions to align with prominent landscape features. To understand Chaco Canyon in its full historical context, you need to lift your gaze from the canyon itself and look outward, across the mesa tops, across the broad basin, across the distances that separate Chaco from the surrounding landscape, because Chaco was not alone. Beginning around the late 9th century and continuing through the 11th century, the communities associated with Chaco Canyon were part of a much larger regional network, a web of relationships, movement, construction, and exchange that archaeologists sometimes call the Chacoan regional system or the Chaco phenomenon. Within this network, the great houses of the canyon appear to have functioned as a center, though exactly what kind of center, and exactly what the nature of its relationship with the broader region was, remains one of the most actively debated questions in southwestern archaeology. Spread across the San Juan Basin and beyond, into areas now covered by portions of northwestern New Mexico, southwestern Colorado, southeastern Utah, and northeastern Arizona, archaeologists have documented more than 200 outlying communities that show architectural and material connections to the Chaco Canyon Great Houses. These outliers, sometimes called Chacoan outliers, typically feature one or more great houses built in the distinctive Chacoan masonry style, associated kivas, and evidence of material connections to the canyon. Some are relatively close to Chaco, others are a day's walk or more away. Connecting these outlier communities to the canyon and to each other is one of the most physically striking features of the Chacoan world, the roads. Chacoan roads are straight, remarkably, persistently straight in a way that distinguishes them immediately from the meandering paths that most pre-contact travel routes follow. They cut across the landscape in direct lines that maintain their direction even when the terrain presents obstacles. Rather than curving around a hill, a Chacoan road climbs directly over it. Rather than following a watercourse, a Chacoan road crosses it and continues in the same direction on the other side. The roads are wide. Most documented sections measure between 8 and 12 meters across, and their construction involved deliberate work. Borders of stone or earthen berms define the road edges. In some sections, the natural soil surface was cleared and smoothed. In others, the road was cut slightly into the ground surface or bordered by low walls. Staircases were cut into cliff faces to allow the roads to navigate vertical changes in elevation. Researchers have documented several major Chacoan road segments using a combination of ground survey and aerial and satellite imagery, which can reveal the faint traces of road construction that are difficult to detect from ground level. The most clearly documented roads connect the canyon to outlying communities to the north, south, east, and west. Some road segments appear to align with cardinal directions, running due north or due south with a precision that has contributed to the archaeoastronomical discussion. The North Road is among the most studied. It departs from the north side of the canyon, from the area near the great houses of Pueblo Alto and Pueblo Bonito, and runs almost due north for at least 50 kilometers, ending at the canyon edge of Cuts Canyon. What lies at the far end of the North Road, why it ends where it ends, what destination or significance that location held, has not been established. Some researchers have proposed that the road may have had ceremonial significance as much as practical function. Others have emphasized that roads can serve multiple purposes simultaneously, and that a ceremonial road is not necessarily different from a practical one. What can be said is that the road system required substantial organized labor to construct and maintain. Clearing, grading, and surfacing roads across hundreds of kilometers of desert terrain does not happen without coordination, planning, and the mobilization of significant community effort. The road system is therefore one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the Chacoan regional network involved meaningful social organization at a scale beyond the individual community, though the nature of that organization remains vigorously debated. Were the roads primarily practical routes for moving people, goods, and information across the landscape? Were they primarily ceremonial, structured pathways for processions, pilgrimages, or ritual movement between significant sites? Were they markers of territorial or political organization, signaling the reach of Chacoan influence? Or were they some combination of all of these purposes, serving different functions at different times and in different contexts? The evidence does not permit a clean answer. What it does suggest is that the builders of Chaco Canyon thought about the landscape at a scale that extended far beyond the canyon walls, that the world as they understood it was not bounded by the sandstone cliffs, but stretched outward in every direction, connected by roads, linked by shared architectural traditions, and perhaps organized by a set of relationships, ceremonial, economic, social, that we can only partially reconstruct. The great houses of Chaco Canyon did not build themselves. Every stone in the walls of Pueblo Bonito was quarried, shaped, and carried by human hands. Every timber in the roofs was cut from a living tree, often many miles away, in the mountain forests of the Chaco Mountains to the west or the Zuni Mountains to the south, and carried without wheeled vehicles or draft animals to the canyon. Every kiva was excavated from the hard desert ground, its walls raised stone by stone, its roof beams positioned by people working together in the canyon heat. The scale of this effort is difficult to convey in numbers, though researchers have attempted the calculation. One frequently cited estimate suggests that the construction of Chaco's great houses required the importation of more than 200,000 wooden roof beams. Most of them carried 50 miles or more from forested mountain regions. That figure reflects an extraordinary mobilization of human labor, not over a single season, but over generations. Who were these people? The ancestral Puebloan communities associated with Chaco Canyon were not a single, uniform population. The San Juan Basin had been inhabited for thousands of years before the great houses were built, and the communities present during the Chacoan florescence of roughly 900 to 1100 of the Common Era were the descendants of long traditions of settlement movement and cultural development in the Southwest. The ancestral Puebloan tradition is most broadly characterized by a transition over centuries from mobile or semi-mobile ways of life, following game, gathering plant foods, moving with the seasons toward more settled agricultural communities whose subsistence depended increasingly on the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash in the high desert landscape. This transition was not a single event. It happened gradually, at different rates in different locations, and the ancestral Puebloan world at any given moment in time contained communities at many different points along this spectrum of mobility and settlement. By the time the great houses of Chaco Canyon began to take their most impressive form, in the late 10th and 11th centuries, the communities of the San Juan Basin had been farming the desert for hundreds of years. They had developed sophisticated techniques for managing the limited water resources of the arid environment. They had built smaller-scale masonry structures and pit houses across the landscape. They had maintained long-distance exchange relationships with communities across the Southwest and beyond. And they had accumulated generations of knowledge about the landscape, the climate, the seasons, and the sky. What daily life looked like for the people associated with Chaco Canyon during the Great House period is something archaeology can partially reconstruct. Corn, maize was the staple crop. Excavations at Chaco have recovered large quantities of corn remains, reflecting both its importance as a food source and the scale of agricultural production required to sustain the communities of the canyon and its regional network. Beans and squash complemented the diet, providing protein and nutrients that corn alone did not supply. Wild plant foods, gathered from the surrounding desert and mesa country, added variety and insurance against the unpredictability of agricultural yields. Hunting also contributed to subsistence. Deer, rabbit, and other animals were hunted using bows and arrows, as well as traps and communal drives. Turkey, domesticated from wild stock, was kept in pens at some great houses, providing both meat and feathers. The feathers of turkeys held practical and possibly ceremonial significance. Turkey feather blankets and robes are documented from ancestral Pueblo sites across the region. Water was the defining constraint. In a landscape that received less than 10 inches of rain annually, and where that rain fell unevenly across the seasons and from year to year, managing water was not merely an agricultural concern. It was a matter of community survival. Archaeologists have documented evidence of sophisticated water management at Chaco Canyon, including earthen berms and masonry channels designed to direct rainwater and runoff toward agricultural fields. These features reflect careful observation of the landscape, an understanding of where water naturally flowed, how it could be redirected, and how even a small enhancement of rainfall capture could meaningfully improve agricultural yields. The people of Chaco Canyon were, by every measure the archaeological record offers, practical, knowledgeable, and deeply attentive to the world around them. Against this background of practical desert life, of corn and water and timber and stone, the question of solar observation takes on a different quality than it might in a purely theoretical discussion. For people whose agricultural survival depended on knowing when to plant, when to expect rain, when to begin the preparations for winter, and when the days would finally lengthen again after the long cold of the solstice season, the movement of the sun through the year was not an abstract phenomenon. It was among the most consequential observable facts of the natural world. Consider the winter solstice. In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, the winter is genuinely difficult. Temperatures drop below freezing regularly from November through March. Snowfall, while not always heavy, occurs. The growing season is effectively suspended. Food stores accumulated through the summer and fall become essential, and the management of those stores, knowing how much had been consumed, how much remained, how many weeks or months of winter were still ahead, was a matter of life and death at the community scale. The winter solstice marked, in the astronomical sense, the turning point of the year. After the solstice, the days would begin to lengthen again. The sun would return gradually, incrementally, but unmistakably to higher arcs and longer days. For communities living close to the rhythms of the natural world, this turning point had a significance that was simultaneously practical, emotional, and, in most cultural traditions, ceremonial. Knowing when the solstice was occurring required observation. You could not calculate the date of the solstice from first principles without a mathematical apparatus that the Chacoan communities did not possess in the form that term implies in modern usage. What you could do, and what human communities around the world have done for thousands of years, was observe the position of sunrise or sunset along the horizon day after day until you recognized that the sun had reached its southernmost point and was beginning its return northward. You could also use a fixed structure or marker, a place where you could stand and observe the sun rising or setting against a specific horizon feature, and where year after year the geometry of the alignment told you where you were in the seasonal cycle. The possible solar alignments at Chaco Canyon in the great houses, in the great kivas, and at Fajada Butte fit within this context. If the builders of these structures were carefully tracking the sun's annual movement, they were doing so not out of idle astronomical curiosity, but as part of the practical and ceremonial management of community life in a demanding environment. It is worth noting, in this context, that the relationship between solar observation, seasonal ceremony, and agricultural practice is well documented among Pueblo communities in the historical and ethnographic record. The Hopi, the Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples of the historic period maintained specialized roles for individuals responsible for tracking the sun, sometimes called sun watchers or sun priests in the anthropological literature, whose responsibility was to observe the sun's position and to announce according to that observation the appropriate times for planting for ceremony and for the seasonal organization of community life. These documented historical practices do not directly prove that the people of Chaco Canyon 1,000 years ago maintained identical systems. The communities of the Chacoan period are ancestral to, but not identical with, the Pueblo communities of the historical period. But the documented continuity of solar awareness and ceremonial solar observation across many generations of Pueblo cultural tradition does provide meaningful context for interpreting the physical evidence at Chaco, evidence that fits comfortably within a broader cultural pattern of solar attention that has deep roots in the Southwest. The communities of Chaco Canyon were not isolated in the desert. They were connected through trade, through shared architectural traditions, through the movement of people and ideas and materials, to a world that extended far beyond the canyon and far beyond the San Juan Basin. The archaeological evidence for long-distance exchange at Chaco Canyon is diverse and substantial. Consider turquoise. Turquoise is a semi-precious stone that occurs naturally in several locations across the American Southwest, with significant deposits in the Cerrillos Hills of north-central New Mexico, representing the closest major source to Chaco Canyon. Excavations at Chaco have recovered extraordinary quantities of turquoise, tens of thousands of pieces in some estimates, including finished ornaments, worked beads, pendants, and raw or semi-worked material. The concentration of turquoise at Chaco is remarkable relative to other ancestral Puebloan sites of the same period, and it suggests that the canyon was either a major production center for turquoise ornaments, a redistribution center for turquoise within the regional network, or both. What turquoise meant to the people of Chaco Canyon, whether it was primarily a prestige material, a ceremonially significant substance, a medium of exchange, or some combination of these, is not fully established by the archaeological evidence. What the turquoise does tell us is that the communities of Chaco maintained meaningful connections to turquoise sources, and that turquoise flowed into the canyon in significant quantities. Shell provides another line of evidence for long-distance connection. Marine shell, primarily from the Gulf of California, hundreds of miles to the southwest, appears in Chacoan contexts as finished ornaments and as raw material. The presence of Pacific Coast shell at Chaco confirms exchange relationships that extended across the desert southwest to the distant ocean coastline. Macaws offer perhaps the most dramatic evidence of long-distance connection. Scarlet macaws, large, brilliantly colored parrots native to tropical Mesoamerica, have been found at several Chacoan sites, including Pueblo, Bonito, where their remains were recovered from contexts suggesting they were kept alive rather than simply traded as skins or feathers. Macaws do not survive in the climate of the San Juan Basin without active care. Their presence at Chaco means that communities there were importing living birds from sources at least 500 miles to the south, in the tropical forests of Mexico, and maintaining them in captivity. Why? The feathers of macaws, brilliant scarlet, yellow, and blue, were almost certainly ceremonially significant, as similar materials are documented as ceremonially important in the historical and ethnographic records of many Southwestern and Mesoamerican cultures. The maintenance of living macaws at Chaco also suggests connections of considerable depth with communities far to the south, relationships that went beyond simple exchange of goods and involved ongoing relationships, specialized knowledge, and the movement of living animals across vast distances. Copper bells, cast in Mexico from native copper, have also been found at Chacoan sites. Cylindrical ceramic vessels found at Chaco show stylistic similarities to vessels associated with Mesoamerican traditions. Cacao, the source of chocolate, has been identified through chemical analysis in residues from cylinder jars at Pueblo, Bonito, suggesting that cacao-based drinks, known from Mesoamerican contexts, were consumed at Chaco Canyon as well. These connections to Mesoamerica are real, they are not speculative. The material evidence is documented and published, but what the connections mean is more difficult to establish. Did Mesoamerican ideas, cosmological concepts, or ceremonial practices travel north along the same routes as macaws and copper bells? Possibly. Some researchers have argued for significant Mesoamerican influence on Chacoan architecture and ceremony. Others have argued that the similarities are real, but that the exchange was primarily one of material goods rather than ideas, and that the Chacoan world developed its own cultural forms independently, even while maintaining exchange relationships with distant communities. The honest answer is that we do not know the full nature of these connections. What the trade evidence tells us is that the people of Chaco Canyon were engaged with a much larger world than the canyon itself suggests. A world that stretched from the tropical forests of Mexico to the Pacific coast. From the mountain forests of Colorado to the desert lowlands of the Sonoran Basin. The remarkable achievements of the Chacoan communities were accomplished against the backdrop of an environment that did not make things easy. Water was, and remains, the fundamental challenge of life in the San Juan Basin. The ancestral Puebloan communities of Chaco Canyon developed several strategies for managing the limited and unpredictable water resources of their landscape. Archaeologists have documented earthen check dams in the side canyons that drain into the main canyon. Low barriers of earth and stone positioned to slow the movement of runoff water and allow it to spread across fields rather than rushing past them. Canals and ditches appear to have directed water from the canyon walls toward agricultural areas on the canyon floor. Gridded gardens, small, bordered plots that helped retain moisture in the soil, may have been used in some areas. These water management features reflect detailed observational knowledge of the local landscape, an understanding of where water naturally accumulated, how runoff moved after rain, and how small engineering interventions could meaningfully extend the productive reach of limited moisture. But engineering has limits in an environment as variable as the San Juan Basin. The dendrochronological record, the treeing evidence that has been so valuable for dating Chacoan construction, also preserves a record of climate variability over the past several thousand years. Tree growth reflects rainfall and temperature. Narrow rings indicate drought years, while wide rings reflect favorable growing conditions. Analysis of treeing records from the Southwest has allowed researchers to reconstruct something of the climatic history of the region with considerable detail. What that record shows for the period of Chacoan fluorescence, roughly 900 to 1100 of the Common Era, is a climate that was generally somewhat wetter than the modern average during the early centuries of the Great House building period. But that became increasingly variable and ultimately significantly drier in the latter part of the 11th century and into the 12th century. A prolonged drought, sometimes described in the literature as the Great Drought. Though this term can give a false impression of a single event rather than a complex and variable climatic period, affected the Colorado Plateau and the San Juan Basin in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. This drought was severe enough that it would have placed extraordinary stress on agricultural communities across the region, potentially exhausting water management systems and reducing agricultural yields to unsustainable levels. However, the relationship between climate change and the transformation of the Chacoan system is not a simple one. The Chacoan regional network had already begun to show signs of change before the most severe drought conditions set in. Major construction at the Chaco Canyon Great Houses appears to have slowed significantly by the early 12th century, well before the most dramatic drought of the late 12th century. Some researchers have argued that the Chacoan system was already experiencing internal stresses, social, political, and economic, that were unrelated to climate. Others have emphasized the interaction between environmental stress and social dynamics, arguing that drought was one significant factor among several. What did not happen, despite popular characterizations that are sometimes encountered, is that the ancestral Puebloan communities of the San Juan Basin simply vanished. People moved, communities reorganized, agricultural strategies changed, new regional centers developed in locations with more reliable water access. The descendants of Chacoan communities became part of the Pueblo communities of later centuries, communities whose descendants live in the Rio Grande Valley, in the Hopi Mesas, in the Zuni country, and across the broader Southwest today. The transformation of the Chacoan regional system is one of the most studied topics in Southwestern archaeology, and it remains one of the most debated. What can be said with confidence is that the history of the Chacoan world did not end abruptly. It changed over decades and generations, as the people who had built and maintained that world adapted to new conditions, made new decisions, and carried their knowledge, their traditions, and their connections to sky and landscape with them wherever they went. We have now traveled far enough into the story of Chaco Canyon, through the great houses, the roads, the people, the trade, the climate, to return to the central question of this documentary with a fuller context. What can the astronomical alignments of Chaco Canyon actually tell us? And perhaps equally important, what can they not tell us? Let us begin with what the evidence most strongly supports. The physical phenomenon at Fajada, Butte is real and documented. On the summer solstice, a narrow shaft of sunlight passes through the gap between the stone slabs and bisects the large spiral petroglyph on the cliff face behind them. This is not a matter of interpretation, it is a documented physical observation. The precision of this phenomenon, the fact that the light dagger falls specifically on the spiral at specifically this time of year, is striking enough that most researchers who have studied it consider the coincidence explanation insufficient. The spiral petroglyphs were very likely created in relationship to the light phenomenon, though whether the slabs were moved to create the phenomenon or the phenomenon was discovered and the spirals then added is a question that archaeology cannot definitively answer. The architectural orientations of the Chacoan great houses suggest deliberate solar awareness. The nearly precise east-west alignment of Pueblo Bonito's back wall, the winter solstice light that enters through the corner doorway of the northeastern rooms, and similar features at other great houses indicate that the builders were paying attention to the sun's position and incorporating that attention into their architectural decisions. The broader pattern of possible alignments across multiple structures, across multiple generations of construction, is consistent with a cultural tradition of solar observation that fits well within the documented historical context of Pueblo's solar awareness. All of this supports a reasonable conclusion. The ancestral Puebloan communities of Chaco Canyon possessed meaningful knowledge of solar cycles and incorporated that knowledge in various ways into the design of their built environment and their use of the natural landscape. But here is where the honest limits of the evidence require acknowledgement. The evidence does not allow us to conclude that every alignment was precisely calculated. Some alignments may be approximate, close enough to suggest solar awareness, without reflecting the kind of engineering precision that a surveyor or astronomer would achieve. Distinguishing between a carefully calculated exact alignment and an approximate orientation that reflects general solar awareness is, in some cases, genuinely difficult. The evidence does not allow us to say what any specific alignment meant ceremonially or socially. Knowing that a doorway lets in the winter solstice sunrise does not tell us what ceremony, if any, accompanied that moment. Knowing that the sun dagger bisects the large spiral does not tell us who observed it, how frequently, whether it marked a specific ceremonial occasion, or what the observing community did in response to the observation. The evidence does not allow us to reconstruct a specific calendar system, a specific cosmological framework, or a specific religious meaning for the solar phenomena of Chaco Canyon. These are things that the physical and archaeological evidence alone cannot provide. They might be approached carefully and partially through the documented cultural traditions of Pueblo descendants, but any such approach requires great care to avoid projecting modern or historical Pueblo meanings directly onto a 1,000-year-old community that, while ancestral to those communities, was not identical to them. The evidence does not support the claim that Chaco Canyon was a single, unified astronomical observatory deliberately engineered according to a master cosmological plan. The great houses were built over generations by communities that were not static. They changed over time, their purposes evolved, their social organization shifted. The alignments, if deliberate, may reflect accumulated decisions made over long periods rather than a single unified design. What remains, after these caveats are applied, is still genuinely remarkable. A community living in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, more than 1,000 years ago, built structures of extraordinary scale and sophistication. Within and around those structures, they embedded relationships with the movement of the sun, relationships that were precise enough and consistent enough to be documented by researchers a millennium later. At the top of an isolated butte at the canyon's entrance, they may have created or recognized a phenomenon in which sunlight and shadow and stone and spiral came together in a way that marked the turning points of the year. The secret of the solstice at Chaco Canyon is not a hidden technology or a lost civilization. It is something quieter and more human than that, the patient attention of people who watched the sky carefully, who learned what the sun's movement meant for their lives in the desert, and who found ways to mark that knowledge in stone. There is a word that appears too often in the popular telling of the Chaco Canyon story, a word that does a particular kind of damage to historical truth each time it is used carelessly. That word is vanished. You will find it in old guidebooks, in television programs, in casual summaries of the Chacoan world. The ancestral Puebloans, these accounts suggest, built their great houses and then, for reasons that remain mysterious, simply vanished from the canyon and the landscape, gone without explanation. Disappeared into the desert. This framing is not accurate, and it matters enormously that we set it aside. The ancestral Puebloan communities of Chaco Canyon did not vanish. They moved, they reorganized. They adapted, as human communities have always adapted, to changing conditions, changing social arrangements, and changing relationships with the land and with one another. The descendants of the people who built Pueblo Bonito and Chaco and Casa Rinconada are alive today. They live in the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley, at Acoma, at Laguna, at the Hopi Mesas, at Zuni, at Taos, at Santo Domingo, and at more than a dozen other communities across the American Southwest. These communities have maintained cultural continuity with the ancestral Puebloan world in ways that are both documented and deeply meaningful. Languages descended from the same language families spoken in Chaco Canyon are still spoken in Pueblo communities today. Pottery traditions, architectural traditions, and ceremonial traditions that have roots reaching back to the ancestral Puebloan period continue to be practiced, adapted, and passed down across generations. The relationship between Pueblo peoples and the broader southwestern landscape, including the specific landscape of Chaco Canyon, has not been severed by the passage of 1,000 years. Many Pueblo communities maintain that Chaco Canyon is not merely an archaeological site. It is an ancestral landscape, a place of cultural and spiritual significance whose meaning cannot be fully captured by the language of archaeology alone. Some Pueblo oral traditions describe relationships with the great houses and the canyon that reach back to the period of their construction. Some communities conduct periodic ceremonial visits to the canyon. The relationship between Pueblo communities and the professional archaeology practiced at Chaco Canyon has not always been without tension. Archaeological excavation, by its nature, involves disturbing the material remains of the past. The excavation of human burials, which occurred at Chaco Canyon during earlier periods of archaeological work, is a particular point of cultural sensitivity for many Pueblo communities, for whom the remains of the dead carry significance that the language of scientific inquiry does not always adequately address. The Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, passed by the United States Congress in 1990, created a legal framework for the return of human remains and associated funerary objects from museums and federal collections to descendant communities. Negotiations regarding the human remains and associated materials from Chaco Canyon have taken place between the National Park Service and Pueblo communities over a period of many years, reflecting the ongoing effort to manage this ancestral landscape in a way that respects both scientific knowledge and indigenous cultural rights. It would be a significant distortion to discuss the sun dagger or any other feature of Chaco Canyon as though the people who made it no longer exist. The spiral on the cliff face at Fajada, Butte, was made by people whose cultural descendants live today, and any responsible engagement with the meaning of that spiral must acknowledge that living relationship. What specific meaning the spiral held for those who made it, what ceremony, what belief, what understanding of the sky is not something that archaeology can recover on its own. Some answers may exist within Pueblo cultural traditions, others may be held privately within communities that have chosen, with good reason, not to share every aspect of their cultural knowledge with the broader public. Respecting that boundary is part of respecting indigenous cultural sovereignty. What can be said is that the sun dagger was made by people who were paying deep attention to the world around them, people whose descendants have never stopped paying that attention. Even as the world has changed in ways no one living in Chaco Canyon 1,000 years ago could have anticipated. Among the great houses of Chaco Canyon, Pueblo Bonito has attracted more archaeological attention than any other, and its excavation history spans more than a century of work that has both illuminated and complicated our understanding of the Chacoan world. The first systematic excavation of Pueblo Bonito was conducted between 1896 and 1900 by the Hyde Exploring Expedition, a project funded by the Hyde Brothers of New York and led in the field by Richard Wetherill. A rancher and self-taught archaeologist from Colorado who had already achieved notoriety for his work at Mesa Verde. The Hyde expedition excavated a large portion of Pueblo Bonito, recovering thousands of objects, pottery, turquoise, shell ornaments, wooden artifacts, basketry, and human remains, many of which were transporting to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. The methods used by the expedition were not by modern standards rigorous. The recording of context, stratigraphy, and spatial relationships was incomplete by contemporary archaeological expectations, which has limited the interpretive value of some of the material recovered. Subsequent excavations by the National Geographic Society, conducted between 1921 and 1927 under the direction of Neil Judd, applied more systematic methods and recovered additional materials while documenting the architectural complexity of the Great House in greater detail. Judd's work established much of the basic chronological and architectural framework for understanding Pueblo Bonito that subsequent researchers have refined. More recent research, including the ongoing work of the Chaco Research Archive, collaborative projects between the National Park Service and university researchers, and the application of new analytical techniques, has continued to add detail and nuance to the picture. Among the most striking findings from Pueblo Bonito is the evidence for the deposition of large quantities of valuable and ceremonially significant materials in specific rooms within the building. Room 28, for instance, yielded an extraordinary concentration of turquoise items, more than 50,000 pieces in some estimates, along with shell ornaments and other materials. The scale of this concentration suggests that this room served a specialized storage or ritual function rather than ordinary domestic occupation. The human burials found within Pueblo Bonito have been the subject of significant study and ongoing discussion. A burial context in the northern section of the building, sometimes referred to as the burial crypts, contain the remains of individuals accompanied by unusually rich assemblages of grave goods, including large quantities of turquoise and shell. Recent ancient DNA analysis, published in the journal Nature in 2017, examined the genetic relationships among individuals buried in this area and found evidence consistent with a pattern of hereditary elite status, specifically evidence of a maternal lineage passed through multiple generations, suggesting that social position at Chaco may have been organized in part through matrilineal descent. This finding is significant because it suggests a degree of social differentiation and hereditary leadership within Chacoan society that goes beyond simple egalitarianism, though the full social implications of this evidence remain a subject of scholarly discussion. Pueblo Bonito also holds architectural evidence that bears on the solar observation question. The Great House is divided into eastern and western halves by a wall that runs almost precisely north-south, bisecting the D shape of the building. This wall aligns closely with the local meridian, the north-south line directly overhead at solar noon. Whether this alignment was deliberate, and if so, what it signified, is a question that remains in the domain of informed interpretation rather than established fact. But the alignment is precise enough to attract notice, and it fits within the broader pattern of solar and cardinal awareness that researchers have identified across multiple Chacoan structures. Chaco Culture National Historical Park, the protected area that encompasses the canyon and its great houses, was established as a national monument in 1907 during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Following growing concern about the looting and vandalism of the site that had been occurring since Anglo-American settlement of the region in the 19th century. The history of protection at Chaco Canyon reflects the broader history of federal heritage management in the American West, a history that has been neither consistent nor without controversy, but that has over the course of the 20th century developed increasingly robust legal and professional frameworks for the preservation of archaeological resources. The site was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987 in recognition of its significance as an outstanding example of pre-contact North American architecture and cultural landscape. This designation brought additional international attention and additional obligations. The United States, as a signatory to the World Heritage Convention, committed to protecting and managing the site according to standards that reflect its global cultural significance. But protection in the modern world is rarely simple. The region surrounding Chaco Culture National Historical Park sits within one of the most energy-rich geological formations in the American Southwest. The San Juan Basin contains significant reserves of oil and natural gas, and the development of those resources through drilling, pipelines, roads, and the associated industrial infrastructure has proceeded at varying rates over the past several decades across lands surrounding the park. The concern among archaeologists, preservation advocates, and Pueblo communities is that industrial development in the broader Chacoan landscape, which extends far beyond the boundaries of the national park, could damage archaeological sites, alter the visual and sensory character of the landscape, and sever the connections between the protected canyon and the outlying great houses and road segments that are part of the wider Chacoan world. These concerns have generated ongoing advocacy, legislative proposals, and administrative actions. In 2022, the Biden administration announced a 20-year moratorium on new oil and gas leasing within a 10-mile buffer zone around the park, a significant but partial measure that addressed new development in the immediate vicinity of the canyon while leaving many outlying Chacoan sites without equivalent protection. The preservation of Chaco Canyon is not only a question of protecting walls of stone. It is a question of protecting a cultural landscape, a way of understanding the relationship between people, architecture, sky, and land that took generations to build and that cannot be reconstructed once it is gone. The great houses are irreplaceable. The roads are irreplaceable. The view from Fajada Butte across the open desert to the distant mesas is irreplaceable. And the phenomenon at the top of the butte, the narrow shaft of light that passes between the stone slabs and touches the ancient spiral on specific mornings of the year, is, like all phenomena that depend on the precise relationship between sky and stone and landscape, profoundly vulnerable to changes that might seem from a distance entirely unrelated to it. Light pollution from industrial activity can alter the darkness of the night sky that makes Chaco Canyon one of the most remarkable places in North America for stargazing. Ground vibration from drilling can shift the positions of stone slabs that have maintained their arrangement for centuries. Road construction across the mesa tops can alter the visual character of a landscape that the builders of the great houses observed and navigated with great care. Preservation at Chaco Canyon is therefore not a completed project. It is an ongoing responsibility, one that belongs to the federal government, to the Pueblo communities with ancestral connections to the site, to the scientific community, and to the broader public that has inherited stewardship of this extraordinary landscape. Before we close in on the final questions, let us pause for a moment and turn our attention upward. The night sky above Chaco Canyon is remarkable. The combination of high elevation, low humidity, minimal light pollution, and the clear dry air of the high desert creates conditions for naked-eye astronomy that are increasingly rare in the modern world. The Milky Way is visible on clear nights as a broad band of light across the sky, dense with stars from horizon to horizon. Planets are bright and unmistakable. The slow movement of stars across the night sky, rising in the east, arcing overhead, setting in the west, is visible in a way that it simply is not from most inhabited places in America today. For the ancestral Pueblo communities of Chaco Canyon, the night sky above their canyon would have been this same sky, or very close to it. The positions of stars change slowly over centuries due to a phenomenon called precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. But over the 1,000-year span of Chacoan occupation, the star patterns visible from the canyon floor would have been essentially the same patterns visible tonight. Archaeologists and archaeoastronomers have examined the question of whether the communities of Chaco Canyon attended to the night sky as well as the daytime sun. The evidence is less definitive for stellar or lunar alignments than it is for solar ones, but several lines of inquiry have been pursued. The moon follows a cycle that is considerably more complex than the sun's annual movement. In addition to its monthly phases, the moon follows an 18.6-year cycle, sometimes called the lunar standstill cycle, during which the rising and setting positions of the full moon sweep back and forth across a wider range of horizon positions than the sun reaches in a single year. At the extreme ends of this cycle, at what are called the major lunar standstills, the full moon rises and sets at positions farther north and farther south than at any other point in the cycle. Some researchers have proposed that certain architectural alignments at Chaco Canyon are oriented not to solar but to lunar standstill events. The Great House of Pueblo Bonito has been analyzed for possible lunar alignments, as have other Chacoan structures. These analyses are more technically challenging and more contested than the solar alignment studies, and the evidence for deliberate lunar alignment is generally considered less definitive than the evidence for solar attention. What is clear is that the people of Chaco Canyon were not isolated from the night sky. They lived in a landscape where the sky was an intimate part of daily and seasonal experience. The stars rose and set with the same regularity as the sun. The moon marked shorter cycles. And for a community whose agriculture, ceremony, and social organization were bound up with seasonal rhythms, the sky, day and night, was part of the lived world in a way that modern light-saturated experience makes it difficult to fully imagine. We have traveled a long distance through this canyon, through its geology and its architecture, through the story of its people and their connection to the sky, through the evidence that researchers have carefully assembled and the debates that remain unresolved. And now, honestly, we must spend some time with what we do not know, what remains unknown about the sun dagger. We do not know with certainty whether the stone slabs at Fajada Butte were moved to their current positions by human hands, or whether they arrived at those positions through natural geological processes. The evidence is consistent with either possibility, though most researchers lean toward the interpretation that at least the placement of the spirals was intentional, made in relationship to the light phenomenon rather than before it. But proof of deliberate slab positioning has not been established. We do not know when the spiral petroglyphs at Fajada Butte were made. The dating of petroglyphs is one of the most technically challenging problems in rock art research. Direct dating methods have limited applicability, and indirect methods, relating the style of the petroglyphs to datable material culture, or using the rate of desert varnish formation as a proxy for age, carry significant uncertainty. The spirals are generally attributed to the Chacoan period based on their location and stylistic associations, but a precise date has not been established. We do not know who specifically made the spiral petroglyphs or observed the light phenomenon. Were they created by specialists, individuals with specific roles in tracking the sun and maintaining calendrical knowledge? Were they created by community members more broadly? Were they observed on specific ceremonial occasions or as part of routine solar tracking? These are questions that the physical evidence cannot answer. We do not know what the spirals meant to the people who made them. Spiral forms appear widely in ancestral Puebloan rock art across the Southwest and carry various associations in different cultural and temporal contexts. They have been interpreted as symbols of water, of migration, of the sun, of emergence, and of many other concepts. No single interpretation applies universally, and any specific meaning assigned to the Fajada Butte spirals would be an interpretation rather than a documented fact. What remains unknown about the Great Houses? Despite more than a century of archaeological work at Chaco Canyon, the fundamental question of how the Great Houses functioned within Chacoan society has not been resolved to the satisfaction of all researchers. Were the Great Houses primarily residential, places where large numbers of people lived year-round? Were they primarily ceremonial, gathering places used for specific events by communities who did not permanently reside there? Were they storage facilities, warehouses for the agricultural surpluses and trade goods that flowed through the Chaco network? Were they elite residences, the centers of a hierarchically organized social system? Or were they some complex combination of all of these functions, varying across time and across individual structures? The evidence supports different aspects of each of these interpretations, and the scholarly community has not reached consensus. Some great houses show evidence of significant domestic occupation. Others appear to have had relatively low permanent populations relative to their size, which has led some researchers to argue for a primarily ceremonial or episodic function. What remains unknown about the Chacoan regional system? The social and political nature of the Chacoan regional network, the relationship between the canyon and the outlying communities, the nature of leadership and decision-making within the system, the degree of hierarchy or equality in social organization, remains one of the great open questions of Southwestern archaeology. The evidence has been interpreted to support interpretations ranging from a relatively egalitarian network of interconnected communities sharing a cultural tradition to a hierarchically organized polity with a dominant center at Chaco Canyon, controlling outlying communities through political or economic power, to something in between, a system organized around ceremonial authority rather than political or economic coercion. Each of these interpretations has support in the evidence. None has achieved the status of settled consensus, and perhaps most fundamentally, what happened? Why did the Chacoan regional system transform so profoundly in the 12th and 13th centuries? The combination of climate stress, internal social pressures, shifting political relationships, and changes in the regional economy likely all played roles. But the precise sequence of events and the relative weight of different factors are still being worked out, generation by generation of careful archaeological research. These unknowns are not failures of archaeology. They are honest acknowledgements of the limits of what the material record can tell us about a complex human society. Every gap in our knowledge is an invitation to continued careful inquiry and a reminder that the story of Chaco Canyon is still being written. The walls of Pueblo Bonito have been standing for the better part of 1,000 years. Think about that for a moment. The masonry that a Chacoan builder laid in place around the year 1000 of the Common Era is still standing, shaped, fitted, set in place without mortar other than mud, in a desert environment of freeze and thaw and wind and occasional flood. The walls have lost portions. Some rooms have collapsed. The great house is a ruin in the technical sense, a structure no longer maintained or inhabited in its original form. But the bulk of its walls remain, and the skill of their construction is visible to anyone who stands before them. Chacoan masonry is among the most admired technical achievements of pre-contact North American architecture. The builders developed several distinct masonry styles over the centuries of construction, each involving different combinations of large and small stones, different degrees of surface finishing, and different structural approaches. The finest Chacoan masonry, sometimes called the McElmo style or the banded masonry of the Classic period, involves the careful alternation of large facing stones with bands of smaller chinking stones, producing a surface that is both structurally sound and visually striking. The precision of the masonry reflects the same attentiveness to craft that the possible solar alignments reflect in architectural planning. Whatever else we conclude about Chacoan society, the evidence of the built environment speaks clearly of communities that cared deeply about the quality and permanence of what they built. The sandstone itself tells part of the story. Chacoan builders quarried stone from the cliff faces of the canyon, selecting pieces that could be shaped into the sizes and forms the construction required. The tools they used were other stones, harder rocks used to peck, chip, and shape the softer sandstone into usable blocks. The effort involved in quarrying and shaping thousands of tons of stone without metal tools is not something that can be absorbed quickly. It requires patient attention to the qualities of the material, knowledge of how the stone fractures and how it can be worked, and the accumulated skill of generations of builders learning from one another. The canyon holds these walls. The walls hold the story of the people who built them, not completely, not transparently, but persistently. The stones remember something, even if they cannot speak directly. The title of this documentary uses the phrase, "the secret solstice." It is worth returning to that phrase now, near the end of our journey, and saying clearly what it does and does not mean. The sun dagger at Fajada Butte is not a secret in the sense of a hidden discovery unknown to the world until modern researchers stumbled upon it. The ancestral Pueblo communities who lived in and around Chaco Canyon were not a lost civilization preserving a forbidden astronomical technology. The spirals on the cliff face are not a coded message waiting to be unlocked by the right interpreter. The secret, if we use that word, is quieter and stranger and more interesting than any of those framings. It is the secret of patient attention. The people who built the great houses of Chaco Canyon lived in a demanding landscape, and they paid extraordinary attention to it. They watched the sky. They watched the way light moved through the canyon at different times of year. They watched the way shadow fell on sandstone in the early morning of the solstice. They noticed the connection between the position of sunrise and the arrival of the growing season. They encoded that attention not in writing, not in documents that have survived, but in stone, in architecture, in the placement of a doorway that catches the solstice light, in the precise location of a spiral on a cliff face near the top of an isolated butte. That encoding was not hidden. It was, in a sense, completely open, written in the largest possible medium, in stone and sunlight and the movement of shadow across an ancient landscape. But it is secret in the sense that reading it requires the same patient attention that created it. You have to stop, you have to be still, you have to watch the light move, you have to come back on the right morning at the right time of year and be present long enough for the sun to show you what the stone has been holding. That is a kind of knowledge that the modern world does not always make easy to acquire. We live in a time when the movement of the sun across the sky can be calculated to the second by a device that fits in a pocket. We know the date of the solstice months in advance. We can simulate on a computer screen what the light at Fajada Butte would have looked like on any morning in the 11th century. This knowledge is extraordinary and genuinely valuable, and it has allowed researchers to study the Chacoan relationship with the sky in ways that would otherwise be impossible. But there is something that the calculation cannot give us, and that the simulation cannot show. The experience of standing in the desert at dawn, in the cold air, watching the sky lighten over the sandstone cliffs, and waiting. waiting with the full knowledge that the sun is coming, that its arc through the sky today will be different from yesterday. That somewhere in the landscape, the light is about to fall in a specific way. That experience is what the builders of Chaco Canyon lived with every day. The secret of the solstice is that it is not really a secret. It is a relationship. A relationship between people and the landscape they inhabited, between the built world and the natural world, between the movement of light and the permanence of stone. That relationship is what the canyon still holds, quietly, patiently, waiting for attention. The sun has crossed the canyon and begun its descent toward the western mesas. The shadows are long now, reaching across the canyon floor in lines that will slowly merge as the light fades. The sandstone walls have changed color through the day, pale gold in the morning, deep amber in the afternoon, and now as the sun drops toward the horizon, they are taking on the deep russet and red-brown tones that make the desert landscape of the Southwest so striking in the final hour of daylight. Fajada Butte catches the last direct light before the canyon floor is in shadow. The Butte's steep sides glow for a few minutes longer than the surrounding terrain, a warm island in the gathering dusk. Near its summit, in a place that most visitors will never reach, the three sandstone slabs lean against the cliff face in the positions they have occupied for longer than anyone living can remember. The spirals on the rock behind them are in shadow now, unilluminated, quiet. Tomorrow morning, the sun will rise again to the east, and the angle of its light will be slightly different from today, by the small daily increment that accumulates over weeks and months into the great seasonal movement between solstice and solstice. The people who watched this movement are gone from the canyon in the sense that the canyon is no longer their home. The great houses they built have been uninhabited for centuries. The roads that once connected the canyon to the wider Chacoan world are silent now, their surfaces covered by centuries of wind-blown soil and creeping desert vegetation. The turquoise and the shell and the feathers have been excavated and catalogued and studied, and in some cases returned, and the rooms that once held them are open to the sky. But the people who built this place, who shaped that stone and raised those walls and climbed to that butte and watched that light, their descendants are alive. They carry the cultural memory of this landscape in languages and traditions and relationships to the sky that have continued changing and adapting through the centuries that have passed since the last great house fell silent. What do we know in the end about the sun dagger and the secret solstice of Chaco Canyon? We know that the phenomenon is real. We know that the light moves in the way that has been documented, passing through the stone slabs and touching the ancient spiral on the morning of the summer solstice with a precision that is difficult to attribute to chance alone. We know that the builders of the great houses of Chaco Canyon paid attention to the sun and incorporated that attention into the design of their architecture and their use of the landscape. We know that the communities who built and maintained this extraordinary place were practical, skilled, and deeply attentive to the world around them, to the quality of stone, to the movement of water, to the directions of the cardinal points, and to the slow arc of the sun through the year. We know that they did not vanish. We know that their descendants live today in communities across the Southwest, maintaining cultural connections to this landscape that no century of time and no weight of history has been able to fully sever. We know that what we have found here in the walls of Pueblo Bonito, in the road segments cutting across the mesa tops, in the precisely aligned doorways that catch the solstice light, in the spiral on the cliff face at the top of Fajada Butte, is not evidence of a lost civilization or a forbidden knowledge or an ancient mystery waiting to be solved by the right modern mind. What we have found is evidence of people. People who watched the sky from this canyon for generations, who learned what the sky was telling them, and who built a world, a large, complex, beautiful, and still only partially understood world, in relationship to what they saw. The night is coming to Chaco Canyon now. The stars will appear as they always have, first one, and then many, and then beyond counting. The same stars that the builders of these great houses watched from the canyon floor, the same stars that tracked the same slow arcs across the same high desert sky. The same stars that are still there tonight above every place on earth where someone is willing to be still long enough to look. The wind in the canyon carries the smell of sage and dry stone and the particular cold clarity that follows sunset in the high desert. The ruins are quiet, the walls are dark. Fajada Butte is only a silhouette now, a shape against the stars. And somewhere near its summit, 3 stone slabs lean against a cliff face in the dark, holding their positions in the patient way of stone, waiting for the morning when the sun will rise again in exactly the right place, and a thin dagger of light will slip between them, once more crossing the rock face, slowly touching the spiral, marking the turning of another year in this ancient and enduring place. The canyon is at rest, the sky is wide. The same sun that crossed Chaco Canyon 1,000 years ago will cross it again tomorrow, and that is enough.